Well, welcome to everybody. I'm very pleased to be in Leuven. The last time I was in Leuven and speaking to an audience, it was on happier issues, basically the Mamluk period and medieval Islamic theology and jurisprudence. Today I will speak about Salafism from a critical point of view. I mean, Salafism and Salafis and the related terminology are in the public and heavily contested and debated. And I think that the categories used in both academia and the larger public and the security agencies are blurred and need a severe critique. How I will proceed, I will first present to you the general consensus when addressing Salafism. This consensus is basically built upon the examination of the political stances of so-called Salafis. The second pillar of the academic consensus is an assumed genealogy which stretches from the early centuries of Islam till today. And of course there is also a core of features to which Salafis are referring, and we will address this too. And I will end with a critique addressing three problematics. First, party politics and the splits in the movements. Then the frame of reference, which is problematic for categorizations, and last I will address the problem of genealogy. The consensus, I mean, I assume that quite a lot of you are aware of this, is centered about division of the so-called Salafist movements. Basically, the assumption that we have a first group, which is by quite a lot of security agencies considered to be, without any interest, the quietists or purists, then the politicos or political or hierarchies, the groups which are active in politics or in the political realm, and then the violent people, the jihadis. And I gave you just a few names from various European and US universities and agencies which have to be mentioned in the field. The division, this tripartite division, is coming from Quinten Viktorovich, who used to serve as the National Security Council of the United States of America. And this formed the perceptions of the so-called Salafis, and I consider this to be problematic. The purists, also called Taqlidis, they engage, as it is said, basically in dawah activities, in missionary activities. Means that they are organizing around the world seminars and conferences, that they record lectures and stream them on YouTube, that they have a program of education, of rebuilding a true Muslim society, built upon certain values and in particular also certain practices. They have a very, very precise understanding what true Islam is all about, both in regard to the sources, that's for them mainly and exclusively the Quran and the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, the Sunnah, and in regard to both sources, the Holy Quran and the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, they are quite selective. They are very, they have their favorite citations, so to speak. And they consider politics to be fitna, to spread division among Muslims. They speak also of hasbiyah, partying, or could be a translation. Therefore, they refrain themselves from politics. And that's also a very old tradition in certain Islamic schools of thought. They accept the existing political authority, even if they consider the concrete rulers or politicians to be kuffar, to be unbelievers, or at least not really Muslims. Common is a division in regard to this group between people who consider themselves to be exclusive, means having really true Islam and all the others are non-Muslims, or people who say, well, the others are perhaps not perfect Muslims, but we have to address them, we have to re-educate them, but they are not excluded from the Islamic Ummah. The second group are the political activists. The most famous group in this regard is the Muslim Brotherhood and all associations, groups, branches stemming from them. The Muslim Brotherhood is quite a funny and amazing association or movement. You could call them at the beginning as an anti-colonial movement. When Hassan al-Banna established the first association in Ismailia, was aiming at kind of continuous adult education. Like in Germany we have an institution called Volkshochschule. It means that you give classes, organize classes and lectures, activities for general education in history and politics and religion, but also in sewing or wood carving or what have you. It was a kind of this. And the Muslim Brotherhood was also a member of the International Boy Scout movement. And you can observe this in the early pictures. If you look at some Muslim Brotherhood groups in the pictures of the 1920s or 1930s, they look like Boy Scouts, or also like the fascists in Italy, or the Falange in Lebanon. Same dressing, short shirts, shorts, and this kind of things. That is a strand which uses party politics to change society and to change political system. The AKP would also be, or the Milli Görüş movement in Turkey would also be an example. Participating in elections and then trying to change the system from within. And the question, the use of violence is sometimes a bit opaque or obscure. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt set up a secret organization which has been armed and served, by the way, also in the struggle against the young state of Israel in the first war between the Arabs and the Israelis. And some advocate in their violence, some do not. Or sometimes they are falling like the Fils de Front Islamique de Salut in Algeria, with the outbreak of the civil war at the early 1990s. They fall into violence and militant jihad. And then, of course, the group which is of most interest, like Daesh, the so-called Dawla al-Islamiyya, militant groups fighting to establish an Islamic State and to set up a different political and societal organization. They have quite and that you can observe nowadays in the broad networks and in groups of people traveling around to make Islamic revolution. You find Chechens fighting in Iraq and Syria, and now they're also fighting in North Africa. You have Algerians fighting in Afghanistan. The jihadis are quite mobile people, and they are like left-wing people in Che Guevara's time. They are where the revolution is, and where Muslims, according to their perception, are under threat and oppressed, and where imperialistic forces are active and has to be confronted. And their worldview is seeing the Muslims worldwide as under pressure, Islam as an endangered religion, be it in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia, or be it in Europe or the West, so-called West in general. Problematic, as I said, is a focus on their position towards politics, because that obscures and hides the underlying religious roots and the underlying religious convictions and practices. And well, as an Islamicist, I'm more interested in this kind of things, but that's quite a demanding task, which I would say nowadays can't be done by a single researcher, because it's so a demanding endeavor. You need a sound knowledge in quite a lot of fields of traditional Islamic sciences. You need a sound knowledge, and in fact you need a sound knowledge in usul al-fiqh, also in Usuluddin, Kalam. You need pretty good knowledge of tafsir and of the classical theological schools and debates to be able to follow the quite precise and fine discussions and controversies. The usual historical genealogy of so-called Salafism runs along more or less along these lines. The big starting father is Ahmed ibn Hanbal, the eponym of the so-called Madhab Hanbaliya, the Hanbali school of law, which is considered to be very conservative and strict, which is, if you look in their textbooks, not always the case. Then it jumped, I mean, from 855 to 1328. That's quite a jump, I would say, to the notorious Ibn Taymiyyah, which, well, in a famous article of the 1990s, Emmanuel Sivon called him the father of Islamic revolution. He's quite often considered to be the one who introduced particular concept of takfir into Islamic thought. Basically, in a famous fatwa against the Mongols, where Ibn Taymiyyah is a scholar, very fascinating scholar, and a former Belgian colleague who is now, after passage in Oxford, is now working in the US. Jean Yahya Michaud has published quite a lot on Ibn Taymiyyah, translated pretty much of his fatwa and his rasail into French, and nowadays also into English. I can strongly recommend his translations. Ibn Taymiyyah was a scholar in the time of upheaval after the Mongol invasion. The Abbasid Caliphate collapsed, and in 1258, and the Mongols were in several waves trying to invade Syria and Egypt, and were defeated by the Mamluks. Mamluks and Mongols shared quite the same cultural and customary background, I would say. However, Ibn Taymiyyah, due to his own personal biography, considered the Mongols to be the bigger evil, and therefore thought of ways confronting and fighting them even after the Mongols and the Mongol Khans converted to Islam. And then he introduced the fine, nice distinction that it does not suffice, as most Muslims thought it would until then, that it does not suffice to proclaim faith and to accept in principle the ibadat, the obligations toward God, but that you have to stick to them and that you have to practice them in detail. Therefore, praying here and there, fasting here and there is not sufficient. It makes you, if you don't do it regularly as prescribed, makes you an unbeliever, and therefore you can be fought and even killed. And Ibn Taymiyyah is the one who introduced this distinction, which is quite common nowadays, and among Salafist groups, takfir is quite common practice. Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya is his pupil, derived a bit, and then we have Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the initiator of the Wahhabiyya, a movement which calls itself Ahl Tawhid or Al-Muwahhidun, the confessors of the oneness of God, or the people of the unity and oneness of God. They don't like being addressed as Wahhabiyya. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was also quite controversial figure, but became important due to his alliance with the Al Saud, the actual ruling royal family in Saudi Arabia, and he was, as quite a lot of scholars on the Arab Peninsula, at least in what is today Saudi Arabia, he was Hanbali in creed and fiqh. Then a figure quite often mentioned, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Shawkani, a Yemenite scholar, who was a strong proponent of the La Madhhabiyya, the idea that it's wrong to stick to a particular school of law, to a madhhab. And he, by incident, became important for Indian Muslim movements, the Ahli Hadith movement, and then by India some ideas came back to the Middle East, especially to Syria. Al-Afghani, that's Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, his pupil, and Rashid Rida, the pupil of both. I learned when I started Islamic studies, or Oriental studies as it still was called when I started. Nowadays, after Edward Said, or the full reception of Edward Said, you can't speak of yourself any longer as Orientalist, but by the time it was quite the normal across Europe. Well, when I started my studies, that's some decades ago, Salafiyya was among academics and scholars associated with Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu as a modernist or modernizing reform movement in Egypt, and then spreading from Egypt to other places in the Middle East in the 19th century. Had nothing to do with today's notion of Salafiyya or Salafism. However, as was shown in an article of 2011 by Henri Lausière, I was asked to provide you with some background reading, and I chose two texts by Henri Lausière. He could prove, also against critique by Frank Griffel, who is an Islamicist at Yale University, that Abdu at least did not use the term Salafia in the sense of kind of ideology or particular school. He speaks of Salaf, but in a very broad sense as, you know, kind of people in the formative period of Islamic thought, that for him it goes for the first centuries, even up to Al-Ghazali. Means, you know, classic, be it in Kalam, be it in fiqh, be it in tafsir, or whatever of the classical Islamic sciences, people helping building up Muslim thought and reflection and derive from the sources practices. And he criticized some deviations. That's where his efforts for ijtihad, for renewance or independent reasoning came in. He questioned two sources for decline in the Islamic world. One, Shiite thinking and philosophy, or extremist Shiite thinking and philosophy. On the other hand, the reduction on the unimportant parts of Islamic tradition. By this he understood that the focus has been on following rules instead of looking at principles, basic principles, which can then be in the detailed practice be adapted, or the practice can be adapted, but you nevertheless stick to the basic tenets of your belief and your religious convictions. And he said, well, people gave this orientation along the maqasid, along the basic features of Islam. They gave it up, and they concentrated on particular tiny little rules, and therefore they have lost the big picture and the general flexibility inherent in the Islamic tradition. And Rashid Rida, well, with him the situation is a bit different. Rashid Rida, in the late 1920s, came in contact with people who were in creed and in the methodology. They were Salafi. He went to Damascus and he worked with the Alusis or with other people, and he turned more towards the Wahhabi understanding of the Salafi approach. And then we have a little shift, and with Rashid Rida we jump to Hassan al-Banna. Hassan al-Banna studied with Rashid Rida and was reading Al-Manar, the famous magazine. And then we have the branch towards the Muslim Brotherhood and all the offsprings, Al-Nakhda in Tunisia, and the movements in Morocco and elsewhere. Leading pillars in the Salafi discursive universe are some scholars who are more or less associated with Saudi Arabian universities and institutions. Muhammad Nasir ad-Din al-Albani, a famous scholar of hadith from Albania, was really born in Skopje, and then went to Syria with his family after the split up or the shrinking of the Ottoman Empire, and then he studied on a private basis hadith. and became one of the most famous hadith scholars of all times, I would say, at least of the 20th and 21st century. And he was pretty strict in his hadith criticism. He, I don't know how many of you are in Islamic studies. Hadiths are classified according to their reliability, so to speak. You have the hadith consists of two parts. One is the so-called isnad, a chain of transmitters, which should, without any break, go back to the Prophet Muhammad. And the other part is the so-called matan, the text of the story itself, that can be a report on an act or on deed of the Prophet Muhammad or of the first companions, or it can be sentences or phrases by the Prophet. And the best are the so-called Sahih. That's also the name of the most famous collection by Al-Bukhari, the sound hadith, the best category. And then the hadith in between, and then you have Da'if. And he classified quite a lot of them, or reclassified quite a lot of them, and is held in very high esteem, not only in Salafi circles, but basically among them. Then Bin Baz, who used to be Mufti of Saudi Arabia. Here they're contested, that's an important figure. And Bin Baz brought Al-Albani to the Islamic University of Medina. But Albani was expelled twice from Saudi Arabia, and he died in exile in Syria. And Al-Uthaymin, a scholar who was asked to become successor of Bin Baz as a Mufti of Saudi Arabia, but he refused. And that's this usual genealogy. However, there are certain gaps and breaks. What happened between the 9th century and the 14th century? What about the 14th and the 18th? I mean, which scholars worked in between? Who were transmitted? I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah was quite marginalized scholar. He has not had many pupils. He was controversial. He was detested. There's a famous story by Ibn Battuta that people thought that he has a screw loose, simply was a madman, a bit insane. Therefore, it's not as famous and central as he is nowadays, both in Islamic studies and in certain Muslim circles. And then we have a break. I mean, from between Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the beginning of the 20th century, fine. I mean, the Wahhabiyya has been present. They have made several attempts, and they were around Mecca and Medina, and quite a lot of Muslim scholars traveled there to study, to perform Hajj, to perform Umrah. Therefore, they came in contact with Hanbali scholars, of course, but also with Wahhabi scholars and with certain brands of so-called Salafi reflections. But I would say there's also a break between Hassan al-Banna and the scholars of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and so on, up to now. The genealogy is not, in my view, is highly problematic. But if you look in a book about Salafism or in an article about Salafism conventional stuff, you will find this genealogy as well as the three groups I have mentioned before. More interesting from an Islamic studies point of view, or from a religious studies point of view, what are the basic tenets of Salafi thinking and practice? First of all, the orientation towards a Salaf as-Salih, the pious ancestors. the first, well, it depends. For Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, it was only the first generation, only the companions of the Prophet, the first Muslims. For others, they would say, well, the first 3 generations. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is sometimes considered to be the last Salaf. I mean, the orientation towards the golden age represented by the Salaf as-Salih, by the pious ancestors, that's quite common for, I would say, most, if not all, Muslims. Because that's the golden age, I mean, and the golden age is a gold standard of reference. That makes also the inner Muslim debates between so-called Salafis and the non-Salafi Muslims quite complicated. How could a Muslim contest, challenge the reference made to the Salaf as-Salih and to the Holy Quran and to the tradition of Prophet Muhammad? That's in principle, I would say, impossible, and makes it pretty difficult to theologically challenge Salafi thinking. Another important aspect, which is sometimes considered to be the kind of litmus test for the Islamicity of a Muslim community, coming from, well, we have several places in the Quran where this particular phrase is given, often in an eschatological setting, when there's saying of the last days of the Day of Judgment, or the Yawm al-Qiyamah. That's Amar bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, commanding right, forbidding wrong. Because every Muslim and every Muslim community, the whole Ummah, is called up to this duty. You should be the community of believers who distinguish itself by commanding right and forbidding wrong. From Jews, from Christians. It's sometimes said that Christians and Jews are doing the same, and sometimes even performing better than Muslims. And Muslims are incited to compete in this duty. It's kind of golden rule. However, what is the forbidden? And what is the right? That has to be negotiated. I would say in a Talal Asadian way of the Islam as a discursive tradition, where you put your reflections into a general frame of practice, and embodied practice and embodied knowledge and discursive knowledge. Well, but that's also a principle where every Muslim normally should subscribe. The next points are a bit more controversial. Al-Wala wal-Bara, that's what I have at the beginning said to be linked to exclusivity and non-exclusivity. Means having a core group of true Muslims, and then you form an in-group, and all others are out. And you show enmity towards them. And you draw a clear distinction line. And that's a form of criteria, I would say, from a sociological, anthropological perspective. When you observe a group or individual people, when they refrain contacting other Muslims, when they stop contacting non-believers, that's a certain indication for a particular position, which is quite often Salafi. Drawing sharp lines towards other other people or do not belong to the same group of conviction. And then takfir, I already spoke a bit about that when speaking about Ibn Taymiyyah, declaring someone an infidel. That has been right from the beginning heavily debated in Muslim society. When there has been the civil war between Muawiyah and Ali concerning caliphate, Ali is the fourth caliph who was then murdered by an Khawarij, by an Hariji, by a member of the Khawarij who did not accept what's the English word? The judgment by a committee between Ali and Muawiyah, because they thought, well, the caliph must be the most pious and can't be chosen by humans out of nothing. They were the first who really radically practiced takfir. People who took another stance towards the question of succession of Prophet Muhammad, they were considered unbelievers, and they killed them directly. And it emerged a school of thought which is despised by Salafis and blamed, the so-called Morjia, the school practice, the idea that someone might be an unbeliever or an infidel or not a true Muslim, but it's not up to human beings to judge or to condemn and even punish them. That's up to God. They postpone the decision about declaring someone an infidel, but the Salafis are quite unreluctant. They are pretty speedy declaring other people infidels. And what are particular topics? Bid'ah, unlawful inventions. That's like the right and the wrong. What does this in concrete mean? If you stick literally to the sources and to the tradition of Prophet Muhammad, then you would say, well, my dear Salafi, no iPhone, no YouTube. Because of that, obviously, Prophet Muhammad did not use iPhones and did not produce videos. He did not drive cars, and he has no microwave. Well, they don't take the concept of innovation in this field too strict, but in others they consider quite a lot of things as being bid'ah, and bid'ah is a reason for fighting others and to condemn them. The practice of takfir and the idea of in-group, out-group is related to an eschatological apocalyptic worldview, which, following a saying of Prophet Muhammad that his Ummah will split in 73 communities and taifas, and that one group only will be saved. One group will be the true Muslims, and the rest will go to hell. That's the common saying. And that's also linked to bid'ah, to the takfir practice, and to the question what is right and what is wrong. Because only the one who do right, command right, and did not follow bid'ah are the ones who are saved at the end, are the ones who are victorious. And how to achieve this? Well, by working on proofs, by investigating Quran and Sunnah, trying to learn Quran by heart, trying to learn Hadith by heart, trying to impose a strict corporal regime. Salafis have normally a very strong body practice. in a Foucauldian sense. They are shaping themselves. And that's not only in regard to, kind of superficial dressing, clothing, beards, but also in detail. They try to imitate the Prophet Muhammad in detail in daily life. In regard to their access to the sources, they have a strict literalistic reading and understanding. They have the impression that the Quran is in clear Arabic and that you can read and understand it as it is. Well, that's a quite Hanbali tradition, which brought the Hanbalis quite often the accusation of being anthropomorphist, because they read the famous throne verse that God is sitting on his throne, literally. And Ibn Taymiyyah in a sermon, in a preaching, said, well, God is coming down from the throne as I am now coming down from the minbar, from the pulpit. And, well, he was brought into prison quite often in his life for anthropomorphism. Therefore, the interpretation is strict. They are against any speculative theology. Their main enemy in thought, in creed, are the Asharis, the Ashari school of theology. They are more because they emerged basically in the Arab world, the Turkish or former Ottoman Empire world, which is basically Hanafi in the school of law and Maturidi in the school of theology. They are not as much in focus. Even if Maturidi, as the Turks claim, it's more rational, should be even a worse enemy than Ashari. And they are, of course, radical anti-Shiite and anti-Sufi. Ibn Taymiyyah is a pretty ambiguous figure in this field as well. He's buried in a Sufi cemetery. In scholarship is discussed if he has belonged to the Qadariya Sufi school. Well, for today's Salafi movements, well, you can say that they are anti-Sufi. In the European context, that is observable in strong clashes between the so-called Ahbash or Habashia, or their headquarters in Lebanon, and Salafi groups. And anti-Shia, the most radical anti-Shia group has been the so-called Islamic State, Daesh, who were so radical anti-Shia that they were expelled from the Al-Qaeda network, because Al-Qaeda considered the Shia in Iraq not the most important enemy, but the Americans and the coalition. But Daesh fought the Shiites in Iraq, and that was even for Al-Qaeda too much. And as I said, they have very particular lifestyles and habits. But as we will address later, that's also observable with other groups. That I have already a bit addressed. The Tawhid issue, they invest quite a lot of thinking in Tawhid. That's categories you will not find in the Encyclopedia of Islam, 2nd edition entry on Tawhid. Tawhid, of course, you will find, but not the differentiation. They work quite a lot on them. One of the most famous texts by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is on Tawhid. And that's a basic theological focus. They are against observing madhabs. For the beginners, they accept Hanbali madhab because, well, you have to learn the rules. and therefore you need certain orientation. But generally they consider only Quran and Sunnah the relevant sources. Therefore they ignore the complete Islamic tradition of thought and knowledge, of whatever kind. And they say, well, everybody has to go afresh to the sources. Therefore they are against taqlid. However, they hold certain alim in high esteem, and they follow them strictly. Among European Salafis who start preaching, quite often they're referring to one single sheikh and simply referring to one or two of his books. They do not practice, ijtihad on their own. They practice quite closely taqlid, but in their view, with the right person. Well, coming to the critique. The critique concerns, first of all, in my view, not tenable division of the Salafi strands in three distinguished groups. First of all, because the frame of reference is shared, and it's not even shared by them, but also by quite a lot of other Muslims who would never consider themselves being Salafis, but who would consider themselves being Salafi in method, which is a difference. Salafi in method means, or in Crete means you draw upon the Quran and the tradition of Prophet Muhammad first and foremost. And you orient your practice, your religious practice, and your daily behavior along the lines of the examples of Prophet Muhammad and of the companions. And that a lot of people doing. I've had a student in my first years in Erlangen who were under surveillance by the Bavarian Internal Secret Services, a convert, because he had a beard in a Salafi way. He has his ankles were free by his short trousers. He has the kameez, the shirt, and they considered him to be a Salafist. And he considered himself to be Salafi in method, but being radical anti-Wahhabi. I called the people called by the security agencies Salafist, he called them Wahhabis. But his frame of reference or still is, I think, of course, the Quran and the tradition of Prophet Muhammad. It's the same frame of reference, but a different way of handling the sources and a different way of treating non-Muslims and other Muslims alike. Not practicing takfir, not excluding them from mankind, from being a human being which has to be treated with respect, and not treating other Muslims who do not share his convictions as unbelievers. And if you look in politics, in the case of Egypt, after the fall of Mubarak, in the first elections, several usual subjects popped up. First of all, of course, the main winner of the election, the party of the Muslim Brotherhood. No surprise. Therefore, in this typology, that's the political hierarchy movement who participate in elections. Fine. But the second group were a coalition of so-called Salafi parties, quite diverse Salafi parties. One party of the coalition, the An-Nur party, is related to, and they took part in the ousting, in the coup, the military coup by Assisi. They backed Assisi's coup against Morsi. This Anur party was established by quietist Salafis, who by theory and this categorization are considered to be apolitical, not taking part in any politics and party politics at all. Then the next group, the building and construction party, Binar al-Tabnir, a group which emerged out of the Jama'at al-Islamiyya, a jihadi group. Also not in the typology considered to be in any form involved in party politics and parliamentary democracy. I would say, well, that's in the proper sense a falsification of the approach, of the classification. At least the classification of this typology, quietist, politicos, jihadis, does not help much. In my view, that's the and well, nowadays with the military dictatorship by Assisi, the situation is a bit different. You can't really speak of party politics and a parliament. However, as long as there has been a kind of parliament, their politics have been quite pragmatic, and the funding or establishment of a political party was inside Salafi circles and inside the group themselves heavily criticized. There was not common sense that, well, there will be elections and let's establish a party and participate. No, not at all. They criticized the establishment of Salafi parties and of parties general, and this way of trying to establish parliamentary democracy after Mubarak severely for religious theological reasons, and they had doing before. I already spoke a bit about my former student, and his example points to the basic problem. When referring to the As-Salaf as-Salih, to the Quran and to the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, is the gold standard the gold standard frame of reference for deriving opinions in creed and practice, then referring to them, saying, well, they are referring to the Salaf as-Salih, therefore we call them Salafis, doesn't really help. Because that every Muslim normally would refer to the Salaf as-Salih, or at least not blame them, saying, well, they are examples of a pious lifestyle. And that makes it quite difficult to distinguish between the groups. There are inner Muslim debates, and the inner Muslim debates, at least in Europe, are along the lines of how to treat other Muslims, how to practice takfir or abstain from takfir. The debates are about Aqidah, differences in dogma and creed. But that's too complex for security people or for political scientists. Because Salafi groups can split about differences in looking at angels. And that's not in in Europe, that's not a topic where you watch 12 hours, 14 hours video discussions. And all these fine differentiations between we are not any longer in the scholastic mood of European Middle Ages. In the 15th century, I assume, in Leuven, theologians and philosophers would perhaps as intense discussed the question of angels. But nowadays, for most people, that's quite strange. But I think the only distinction between the groups can be made by investigating this kind of archaic differences. And that's not always funny reading. It's not always easy reading, but that has to be done if we wish to establish a real categories which are sound and valid. That I already questioned when we spoke about the genealogy. There are a lot of questions concerning this imagined history of ideas and concepts. And it's not totally clear, even after the pioneering work by Henri Luzière, if there has been perhaps here and there different ways of using the term Salafi than he has been able to trace. There are still gaps in our understanding of why and how and by which means so-called Salafism, the ideological side of things, became so growing since the 1980s. That can't only be oil money from Saudi Arabia or so. There must be also other reasons. What makes it so attractive? Research has begun a bit. I mean, in a globalized world where everything goes, where no real rules exist any longer, a worldview and practice which is clearly shaped in black and white, which imposes a strict regulation of life on a daily basis, can give and provides reason for sticking to this particular practices, because it's promised paradise and being among the chosen ones is of course attractive. And if you look at the biographies of people adhering to such groups, you find a lot of former small little tiny criminals, of people who are not successful in the globalized market economy liberal sense, but who can gain strong identity and a clarity for life. And I think that's what makes them perhaps most attractive, being among the winners on the long run, with eternity inside, and having a sense and purpose in life. I consider this to be perhaps not a task for an Islamicist to address the challenges posed to Islamic thought and reflection and the emergent Islamic theology also in Europe, but it's a task for Muslims to rediscuss or to continuously discuss their tradition, again in the Tal al-Assadian sense, to renew what my colleague in Germany, Thomas Bauer, in a brilliant book, I think it's not yet translated. I would, for everybody who is able to read or to understand at least a bit of German, I strongly recommend this book. It's called Culture of Ambiguity, a Different History or Another History of Islam, where he stresses the factual ability of Islamic culture and tradition to maintain a very high degree of ambiguity and tolerate ambiguity, and therefore difference, that you can be Muslim in the Ummah with different opinions regarding particular questions and practices, as long as you stick to certain methodology and to certain rules and to certain practices of reading the sources. I think as long as Muslims are not rediscovering, renewing this form of ambiguity, tolerance, there will be a still ongoing struggle with Salafist in the theological sense, thought and practice. And I thank you for your attention. I danke wel voor uw aandacht.